Bonjour again, and welcome to episode 3 of my French Revolution vlogcast. In the previous 2 episodes, I looked at the social context of the French Revolution and considered a little bit about Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI and their role, or how they how they were running the country at the time of the French Revolution. And in this episode, we're going to think about the financial context up to the sort of early 80s and the longer term or medium term financial context. As you'll probably know, it was very poor. The finances of France were in a complete mess, really even before Louis XVI becomes king. And that is for 2 main reasons. The first main reason is that the French, in fact 3 main reasons. The first reason is that the French tax system was very inefficient and ineffective. They had tax farmers collecting the taxes, but they tended not to ask them for as much as they could get, and the tax farmers were collecting more than they'd promised to get, making money for themselves but not passing it on to the crown. And as you know, of course, the first and second estate didn't have to pay a lot of tax, and so that was inefficient too. Secondly, the royal family had spent a lot of money and continued to spend a lot of money rather than reining that in. Now, probably not that much out of proportion with other royal families in Europe at the time, but nevertheless they couldn't afford it. And the classic example of this is the palace at Versailles. It is enormous, it is opulent, and it's completely at odds with the spending of ordinary citizens or the wealth of the nation. And that's why Marie Antoinette's gambling debts create so much offence, because, you know, again, these are debts at a time when the country itself is in financial problems. The third and the most serious reason are the wars that France has been involved in the previous couple of decades. The first one of those was the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was fought by France against Britain and other nations, but mostly France against Britain, and fought on a global scale. In fact, I think it was Winston Churchill called it the First World War. That doesn't really matter to us. What does matter to us is that in 1763 the war ended with the defeat of France, and because they lost their money that they put into the war. They lose the colonies that they had before the war, which means that they lose those money-making opportunities to get the cash back that they'd spent in the war. And it also provides the motivation for them getting involved with the American War of Independence later on. Now, this is in Louis XVI's reign, and he therefore is responsible for this spending. The American War of Independence was hugely expensive. There were about, I think, 1,066 million livres were spent by the French government on the American War of Independence. 91% of that spending was paid for by loans. And that actually is the root, really, of the problem for France. That in the American War of Independence they were on the winning side, but they didn't really get anything back for it, apart from the thanks of the Americans, and perhaps some some trading opportunities, but low reward, I guess, on those. And they still saddled with these debts. The problem for the French French nation, was that they were accruing debts, and therefore not just having to pay the money back, but also have to pay the interest back. So, huge financial problems, huge financial mess. Now, again, as I'm sure you know, there were some attempts to reform and change this situation years before the French Revolution kicked off. The first 2 of these are important and just show show different options for doing that. The first one was under the Controller Generalship of Turgot. He was the first finance minister of Louis XVI's reign, and he tried to take a more laissez-faire approach to the economy. Laissez-faire means kind of hands off, that the government would not control and regulate the economy and would allow it to regulate itself and work its own way. Prices would rise and fall depending on supply and demand. So he ends the tariff on grain, which should bring prices down, But he does that just before there's a really appalling harvest, and in fact prices go up, and that contributes to was probably the main reason really why Turgot was not liked amongst the lower classes. He also did the meat tariff, but that was unpopular. He tried to end the corvée, the road maintenance scheme, I guess they had, feudal right that they had, and replaced that with a tax, but that was unpopular with the aristocracy. And unfortunately, he also tried to bring a land tax, which all people would pay. So he tried to reform the taxation system as well as kind of the economic makeup of France. Unfortunately, he runs into blockages on that, opposition on that, and he threatened to use the lit de justice powers to get past that. Now that sort of posturing didn't go down very well with his opponents, and as is typical in the story, Louis XVI backs down and decides that for an easier life, a quieter life, he'll try someone else at the helm. It's also true to say that Turgot was against future wars because he said France can't afford them. And at this time, the American War of Independence was becoming more likely to happen, emerging as an issue. And so popular support was drifting away from Turgot anyway. The second financial attempt to change, or the second path to change, as I'm sure you know, is exemplified by Jacques Necker. Jacques Necker was a Swiss Protestant outsider, financial magician. He couldn't even be Controller General because he was Protestant, so he had to be Finance Minister. They had to make up that title so that he could take the post. He was first Finance Minister from 1777 to 81, and his solution essentially was to save money by cutting down on spending, which he successfully managed to do. He cut a lot of venal jobs. He had to pay people off for them, but he managed to cut 406 jobs in the King's kitchen alone. Can you imagine how many, what? 406 jobs in the King's kitchen? It's extraordinary. That of course makes him a number of enemies because all these people are annoyed about losing their position that they had. Of course they weren't doing the job, it was just kind of a title of convenience. Necker's more famous and perhaps important strategy was to borrow more money. And to do that, he produces this Compte Rendu de Roy, the first balance sheet for the French economy, in which he lies, kind of. He conceals the truth, certainly. He lays out the ordinary income and expenditure for the French government in an ordinary year. And he says, look, we've got enough money coming in to cover our outgoings, lend us money. And so, of course, people did. What he didn't show was that the years that they were operating in were not ordinary, and that there were a lot of other things they were having to spend money on, military expenditure as well. So he gets in a lot of trouble for that, and also the finance ministers that come after him, when they say, everything's really bad, several of them are disbelieved because people say, well, hang on a minute, Necker said things were okay. And so just in that snapshot, it's quite a long podcast, I'm sorry about this, but in that snapshot, what you can see is firstly that the French situation was very poor and very serious and getting worse, but also that attempts to solve it early on through Turgot and Necker both failed because of obstruction and lack of backing from the king and from the aristocracy, and both result in actually making the situation worse. And that, of course, is why you've got a further financial crisis in the years leading up to the immediate years leading up to the French Revolution. Probably deal with that next time. See you there.